Mr. President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, the Senate last night passed the intelligence authorization bill, and it contains some very important provisions relating to whistleblowers. And while Senator Collins is on the floor, I want to commend her for her extraordinary work on this. She has been at this for years, and it is a pleasure to be able to team up with her in this effort. And I think it's fair to say both of us are very appreciative of the work done by our chair, Senator Feinstein, who did so much to make this possible. And, Mr. President, I'm going to be very brief. Senator Harkin, Chairman Harkin, has some important remarks to make this morning. He graciously allowed me to go ahead and just want to reflect a little bit on where we are with respect to whistleblowers and the ability of intelligence agency employees to speak out on matters that do not affect national security but are important to the debate about how to ensure that our country resolutely fights terror and protects the public's right to know. Now, I think it's fair to say, and I make this judgment on the basis of having been on the Intelligence Committee for 13 years now, that the very important and worthwhile efforts to protect national security after the terrorists murdered more than 3,000 of our people on 9/11, those important efforts to protect our people from terror were also accompanied by a lot of overreaching by the intelligence leadership. In recent years, I think it's fair to say reformers have made some real progress in our efforts to address that overreach. And now with the Patriot Act and other measures coming before us and the country really understanding what's at stake, I think it's going to be possible to make additional progress. And the reason I came to the floor today to discuss whistleblowers and the ability of intelligence employees to speak out is a lot of the progress that we have seen recently would not have happened without whistleblowers and without some of the intelligence agency employees who are willing to risk their very career to draw attention to real and serious problems. And I also want to make note of the fact that there were journalists who worked hard to report the facts responsibly and ensure an informed public debate that is so essential to our democracy. Now, here's why the whistleblower issue is so important. There are existing laws and regulations that say that employees of American intelligence agencies who are concerned about possible misconduct like waste and fraud and illegal activity are allowed to report that. And these laws and regulations lay out channels for doing it. Now, the reality is that these principles, and the idea is that if there's misconduct, you report it to one of these entities, the oversight entity would have some opportunity to do something about it. Now, unfortunately, reporting misconduct by your colleagues or by your agency doesn't always work out so well. And that's why rocking the boat and reporting misconduct can sometimes be hazardous for an individual's career. And if a government employee thinks about blowing the whistle or on possible misconduct, but can see that their supervisor or someone in their chain of command is condoning or participating in that misconduct, the employee is rightly going to be concerned about possible retaliation. It won't get that promotion and might not even be able to retain their security clearance. So, Title VI of this year's Intelligence Authorization Act strengthens the ability of those whistleblowers to come forward. It prohibits retaliation against intelligence whistleblowers who report misconduct using approved channels, and it includes disclosures to the Congress or to an inspector general. It requires the executive branch to establish an appeals process for whistleblowers who have their security clearance unjustifiably revoked. Establishing these protections in statute, in my view, is an important advance forward. So we're making some progress there with respect to whistleblowers, but we're not doing so well with respect to making sure that we're protecting the abilities of our employees in the intelligence field to speak out. Now, recently, the head of national intelligence issued a new policy directive regarding agency employees' contact with the media. And I will tell you, Mr. President, I am troubled by how sweeping in nature this is. At the outset, this is supposed to prevent disclosures of genuinely sensitive information. That's obviously, an important goal. But it's also important to make sure that as you carry that provision out, you don't keep employees, for example, from being able to talk about non-classified matters. Now, the new policy makes it clear that intelligence agencies employees can be punished for having contact with the media about intelligence-related information. Make no mistake about it, Mr. President, that is so broad that it could cover unclassified information. It really doesn't lay out any limits on this extraordinarily broad term that I've described. For example, is an employee's opinion about the scope of the NSA's domestic surveillance activities intelligence-related information? Are publicly available assessments about developments in Syria or the Ukraine intelligence-related? This new directive doesn't say that, but it certainly points in that direction. Now, it becomes even more problematic if you read further down into this new policy and review the definition of the word media. It includes any person or entity engaged in the collection, production, or dissemination to the public of information in any form related to topics of national security, which includes print, broadcast, film, and the internet. This is extraordinarily broad. It goes well beyond professional news gatherers to include anyone who uses the internet to disseminate any information at all relating to national security topics. So if you're an employee of an intelligence agency and if you have a family member who likes to post or retweet articles about national security, suddenly having a conversation with that family member about important issues like NSA surveillance or the war in Afghanistan could lead to you getting punished for having unauthorized contact with the media, which this directive says, and I quote, will be handled in the same manner as a security violation, regardless, Mr. President, of whether or not any classified information is disclosed. So I'm willing to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and that some of the authors of this policy didn't intend to have this happen. And I know that trying to make definitions of who is and isn't a member of the media is going to be a challenge with these new media technologies. But that doesn't remove the fact that this policy is too broad. It's too sweeping. It incorporates too much of what we want in Montana and Oregon, which is to make sure that our people can talk about the policy issues that afford them the information so they can cast a ballot. And my hope is that we can get this corrected, because I think this is going to have a chilling effect on intelligence professionals who simply want to talk about unclassified matters on important national security issues like how to reform domestic surveillance or whether or not our country should go to war. So, Mr. President, in closing, and I thank my colleague from Iowa on this, we have made progress. Back in 2012, there was an overly broad anti-leaks bill that was reported by the Intelligence Committee. It came out of the committee on a 14-to-1 basis. I was the opposing vote, and at that time, Mr. President, I knew it was a flawed policy, but I didn't even know how flawed it was because we weren't able at the time to talk to outside parties. When it was ready for the floor, the country and journalists and citizens saw how sweeping it was, saw how flawed it was, the damage it would have done, again, to discussing non-classified matters. and we got it corrected. But suffice it to say, we are going to have a host of challenges in the years ahead. And while we have won victories, like against that overly broad anti-leaks policy, when we were able to derail what would have been the biggest invasion of privacy in our country's history, the Total Information Awareness Program, which was really derailed because a young person in our office found a memo that demonstrated just how sweeping it was. While we have made progress, we have a lot to do. We're in better shape this morning because of the passage of that intelligence authorization bill and the additional measure of protections for whistleblowers. And Senator Collins and the chair of the committee, Senator Feinstein, deserve enormous credit. But make no mistake about it, we have a lot of work to do. And certainly that new media policy that has come from the Director of National Intelligence that is so broad that it could really make it difficult to talk about unclassified matters on the internet. That is just one example of the kind of issue we're going to have to zero in on in the days ahead. And I also note that our next speaker, Chairman Harkin, has been a great advocate on these kinds of issues as well, and I thank him for his courtesy so I could go ahead. And I yield the floor.